Okay, now we are back in 2025. Um, One fortunate development that we have identified is that there's a strengthened European identity or identity towards a form of European wholeness, if you will, because of these uh, attacks on the sides to European identity. There's an emergence of a new generation of leaders, which we don't know, but somewhere in September we will see an ideal leadership emerge. We have a an arrangement that leaves Ukraine as an unfinished conflict, with one fourth of its territory being disputed, with a recognition that Russia can run it until the dispute is resolved. And we have two scenarios in the making. And Florian Bieber is asked with a group of five other people by the European Union to advise how to pursue further the idea of European wholeness.
Um, I mean, for me, one clear priority seems to be, first of all, completing in a certain way the European Union project of enlargement. I mean, bringing the countries in which should be brought in with clarity, including Ukraine.
Three-fourths of Ukraine.
Three-fourths of Ukraine. I mean, Cyprus is a member of the European Union. Half or a third of it is occupied by Turkey. So, I mean,
probably the best example you want.
Well, but
you want more Cypruses inside?
Well, I would say, it's a functional EU member state for 21 years. Is it better if it were unified? Absolutely. Was opportunities missed back in 2000s to unify Cyprus? Absolutely. But you can be a member in the European Union. You can find legal ways of addressing part of the territory which is occupied. And of course, in the case of Cyprus, the history of occupation is much more complicated than in Ukraine, because there was a genuine dispute on the island, unlike in Ukraine where this conflict was brought in by Russia. But you can have, I think, giving Russia the veto power over Ukrainian membership in the European Union would be a mistake, because it creates an incentive for Russia to do that. And keeping Ukraine out of the European Union, a country which has fought a war, no matter how it ends, with the level of sacrifice, would also create an amount of bitterness, because after all, this war was fought also about, not just about survival, but also about the European direction of Ukraine.
But wouldn't that, when you say Ukraine, would that mean that everybody's calendar has to be adapted to Ukraine's capability of entering the European Union?
No, I don't think so. No, I mean, bringing, in a certain way, completing European integration means bringing all the countries which want to join in, not at the same time, but having a very clear political vision of completeness. Now, it doesn't mean that the EU itself has to change. We know that. But completing that membership is very important, because we discover that countries which are in this gray zone, like Ukraine was, make them extremely vulnerable. I mean, yes, it's a NATO story, but it's also a European story. And if Europe wants to become a significant actor domestically in the European continent and globally, it has to complete this process. I mean, how can the EU be credible in talking with South Korea or anybody else about security when it can't resolve issues of ending either a conflict or a dispute in the Western Balkans, or bringing those countries in?
Yeah, but then the argument would be, how is the European Union capable of integrating Ukraine if it hasn't been able to integrate Bosnia-Herzegovina or North Macedonia, which are much smaller territories,
Absolutely.
much smaller problems?
No, that's why I would say, what I would argue is also, Ukrainian membership in the European Union is certainly not, in the cards in the coming 3, 4, 5 years. I mean, this is a long-term project, not just because of the war, because of the size of the country, because of many challenges. But that sense, the
2050?
No, I think it could be sooner. It could be a lot sooner. I mean, I think a country like Ukraine, could be a member in a decade or in 15 years, 2040, even before that. If there is the right motivation. I mean, I think enlargement works when there is a sense that that yes, you have to do the technical stuff, but there's a political sense that this is the right thing to do for Europe. This is why 2004 worked with all the flaws, because there was a sense that this was undoing Yalta. This was the idea. And the Central East Europeans convinced the old EU that this was the historically right thing to do. And they knocked on the door and they pushed and they pushed and they got it. I think the EU forgotten why integrating the Western Balkans has a similar purpose. It's not about Yalta, but it's about providing a peace, a durable peace, because we saw that the peace agreements which ended the wars of the 90s were only effective with the promise that there would be a European future for the countries. And we're seeing right now exactly the absence of that brings about a continuous crisis. So ending this process for the Western Balkans is, I think, crucial also for signaling for Ukraine that this is not a never-ending process. There is an end point, and it's desired by the European Union.
Yes. But if we, okay, now let's go back to 2030. And you have an analysis of what went on in Serbia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. From the perspective of 2030, what happened in Serbia with a student protest that basically grew into a national movement, a revolt. And what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina when Mr. Dodik was not only indicted, and I'll leave it at 3 points there. Mm-hmm.
Well, again, if we're in 2030, I would say it's likely that Milorad Dodik is in a jail somewhere, arrested because of what he's been sentenced for by Bosnian institutions. And we have a different political dynamic in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Doesn't mean that Bosnia is a unified, functional country, but there's more space for compromises and finding mutually interesting arrangements to make the country work.
Do they have a constitution?
You mean a better constitution?
No, a constitution, because they don't have one.
Well, yeah, it's a very. I mean, they have a constitution. It's just not a very good one. But I would say, I think they will tweak the constitution. I don't think they will have a new constitution, but they will make the adjustments which make it more functional, which they tried and which failed, and that's something that could happen. And in Serbia, there's no more President Vučić in 2030. If you have 300,000 people on the streets, supported by somewhere between 60 and 80% of the population, then you are going to lose power probably. So let's say in the good scenario, we don't have him as president of Serbia, and instead somebody else, we don't know who, but they will be certainly burdened by the legacy of that regime, just like those who came after Slobodan Milosevic were burdened by that legacy. It's not a legacy of war, but it's a legacy of nationalism, of corruption, of state capture. And this takes years to deal with, but it's a gradual shift which will come after.
So we have a Petar Petrovic who resembles Zoran Đinđić, but does he have the popular support to go with reforms?
Well, Petar Petrovic or whoever else it will be, I don't know. I don't think there's necessarily a Đinđić, because again, Đinđić was already kind of clearly there before. But what the students go on the streets for in Belgrade is, of course, rule of law and democracy, much more so than in the 90s in Serbia. I mean, there were anti-war protests, there were protests against Milosevic, but they weren't so clearly about rule of law and the fact that the students are saying you're not in charge to President Vučić, you're not competent, suggests that they understand what it means when somebody is an autocrat. And so I think that will be a powerful, whoever comes afterwards, message that, people don't want another strongman, in fact, but rather want somebody who's maybe just doing their job, which is more modest and more humble. That would be an important break. I mean, It will be very messy, of course, but messy might be better than one man who controls everything and micromanages everything.